On the morning of February 3rd, 1977, a farmer named Harmon Diehl walked from his farmhouse to his shop in Logan County, Ohio, and could see his breath before he got to the door. The thermometer on the shop wall read 14 degrees. The space heater in the corner had been running since 5 a.m. when Harmon had gotten up to start it before breakfast, and the shop had climbed from the overnight low of 7 degrees to 14. There was frost on the inside of the windows. The concrete floor held the cold the way concrete holds cold in February, not releasing it, not yielding to the heater, just staying cold. Harmon was 42 years old. He had a 1959 vintage large row crop tractor on the shop stand with the engine partially disassembled, 12 hours of winter work already in it, and approximately 30 more hours of work ahead before the engine would be ready to start. Planting was 11 weeks away. He had the time. What he did not have was warmth. He picked up his tools and started work. His neighbor across the road, a man named Gil Faber, had come over the previous Saturday when the temperatures were still in the 20s and had looked at the engine on the stand. Gil had looked at the shop. He had said, "Harmon, why don't you wait until March? You could move the tractor to the barn, get a bigger heater in here, do this when it's not 14 degrees in your shop." He had said, "You're going to freeze yourself doing this work in February." Harmon had said, "The planting window doesn't move because I'm cold." Gil had said, "You've got time. It's February 3rd. Harmon had said, "I know what day it is." Gil had driven home. Harmon had gone back to the engine. He had finished the rebuild on February 28th, 25 working days after Gil's visit, the engine running clean on a February morning that was, if possible, colder than February 3rd. He had driven the tractor out of the shop on February 28th and into the farm lane and listened to the engine idle in the cold air. The engine had sounded the way a rebuilt engine sounds when the work has been done correctly, even strong, with no bearing noise and no coolant in the exhaust and no oil in the coolant. He had driven it back into the shop and started on the planter service that was next on the list. His neighbor, Gil Faber, had not started his own engine work until the 3rd week of March, when the temperatures climbed into the mid-30s and the shop held enough heat to work without a coat. Gil had a 1971 large vintage machine that needed a valve job. Not a full rebuild, a valve job, 6 to 8 hours of work. He had not been behind. He had just not started. He had finished the valve job on March 31st, 10 days before the planting window opened in Logan County. Harmon had been ready on March 1st. 10 full weeks before the window, every piece of equipment on the farm checked, serviced, and ready. The 1977 planting season in Logan County, Ohio, was not a crisis season. The weather cooperated reasonably. The window opened on schedule and stayed open. Both Harmon and Gil got into the ground within a few days of each other. But the 1977 harvest was exceptional. Not because of the planting date. They had planted within a few days of each other, and the planting date difference was not meaningful. The yield difference came from a single afternoon in July. Let me tell you about the July afternoon, because the July afternoon is where the February shop work proved its value in a way that had nothing to do with being first in the field. On the afternoon of July 14th, 1977, Harmon's tractor threw a hydraulic hose on the north field during cultivation. Not a catastrophic failure, the hose had developed a crack at the fitting, and was weeping fluid rather than gushing. But cultivation stops when the hydraulic lift stops, and the hydraulic lift stops when the hose pressure drops below the system requirement. Harmon had been running the cultivator behind the 1959 tractor, the one he had rebuilt in February. The hydraulic hose failure had stopped cultivation at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. He had driven to the shop. He had looked at the hose. He had gone to the parts cabinet and found the spare hose fitting he had installed in December. He kept spares of every hydraulic component on every tractor, a practice his father had established and that Harmon had continued without exception. He had replaced the hose in 38 minutes. He had been back in the north field by 3:05. The cultivation had been completed that afternoon. Gil Faber's tractor, on the same day, had blown a hydraulic cylinder seal in his south field at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. Gil had not had a spare seal kit in his parts cabinet. He had driven to the dealer in Bellefontaine, 40 minutes each way, waited for the part, driven back, and installed the seal in the early afternoon. He had lost approximately 5 hours. The 5 hours had not been catastrophic. Gil had completed his Southfield cultivation 2 days later. The corn had been fine, but 5 hours of lost cultivation during the critical July window, the window when the corn is in the rapid vegetative growth phase and every missed day of cultivation represents weed pressure that compounds through the season, had a measurable effect on Gil's final yield, not a dramatic effect. Approximately 4 bushels per acre on the south field, which was the field most affected by the weeds that had emerged during the delay. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, have you ever had a parts cabinet save a field day when it mattered? Harmon's 1977 corn yield, 147 bushels per acre. Logan County average, 126 bushels. Best yield of his farming life to that point. Not because he had planted first. He hadn't. Not because the season had been perfect. It hadn't. Because in February of 1977, he had been in a shop where he could see his breath, working on an engine while his neighbor waited for March, and the work he had done in February had included a thorough check of the spare parts cabinet that had found and replaced the hydraulic hose fitting that was approaching the end of its service life. The hose fitting had been in the cabinet on July 14th because Harmon had put it there in December. Harmon had checked the cabinet in February because the February shop work included checking the cabinet the same way it always included checking the cabinet, the same way it had always included everything on the list. Gil had finished his valve job on March 31st. He had not gone through the parts cabinet in the same systematic way Harmon had gone through it in February, because March 31st was 10 days before planting, and there was not enough time for both the valve job and the full cabinet audit. The full cabinet audit was February work. The valve job was February work. If Gil had started in February, he would have had time for both. He had waited for March. He had time for one. Let me tell you about the almost quit moment for Harmon, because it happened at approximately 11:30 in the morning on February 7th, when the shop temperature was 11 degrees and Harmon's hands were so cold that the torque wrench was difficult to control accurately. He had been installing the main bearing caps on the rebuilt crankshaft. Main bearing cap installation requires torquing the cap bolts to a specific value, not approximately, specifically. Too little torque and the bearing can spin in the saddle. Too much torque, and the cap can distort, creating a bore that is not perfectly round and that will produce bearing failure within hours of startup. Harmon's hands were too cold to feel the torque wrench break clearly. He could hear the click. He could not feel it distinctly in fingers that were approaching the point where cold becomes a liability rather than a discomfort. He had stopped. He had set the torque wrench on the bench. He had stood beside the engine for a moment. He had thought about Gil's suggestion, wait until March, bigger heater, warmer shop. He had thought about whether the specific work he was doing at this specific moment was safe to do at 11 degrees with cold hands. He had concluded, no. Main bearing cap torquing at 11 degrees with cold hands was not safe. The torque specification was not something to approximate. He had done something he almost never did in the shop. He had stopped work for the day. It was 11:30 in the morning. He had gone inside. He had eaten lunch. He had thought about the problem. He had come back to the shop at 1:30 in the afternoon with a different approach. He had brought the propane torch from the house and had set it up to heat the specific area of the engine where the bearing cap work needed to happen. Not the whole shop, which the space heater was inadequate for anyway, but a targeted area of warmth around the working surface. He had also brought the wool gloves his wife used for gardening, which were thin enough to maintain tool feel while providing enough warmth to restore some finger sensitivity. He had torqued the main bearing caps at 1:45 in the afternoon with a heated work area and thin wool gloves. He had felt the torque wrench break clearly. He had checked each cap bolt twice. The torque was correct. He had told me about the 11:30 stop 40 years later. He had said stopping was the right decision. He had paused. But stopping for the day was wrong. He had paused. I needed 30 minutes to think about the problem correctly, not a day off. He had been right. Stopping for 30 minutes and coming back with a specific solution had been the correct response. Stopping for the day would have been allowing the cold to win the argument. The cold had not won the argument. The torch and the wool gloves had. He had finished the main bearing caps at 2:15 on February 7th. He had continued the rebuild. Let me tell you about the 25 days between February 3rd and February 28th, because the February rebuild is the kind of work that is described easily in general terms and understood only in specific ones. Day 1 through 3, full engine teardown and assessment. Measurements taken and recorded. Cylinder bore diameters at top, middle, and bottom of stroke in 2 perpendicular directions. Crankshaft main and rod journal diameters, valve stem diameter and guide clearance, rocker arm clearances. The assessment had confirmed what the compression check the previous fall had suggested. The bores were worn to the point where the first overbore was appropriate. The valve stems were worn to the point where new valves were required on 2 cylinders, and the crankshaft journals were within specification, but at the lower end of the acceptable range. Day 4, block and head to the machine shop in Bellefontaine. Cylinders to be bored 0.030 over, head to be resurfaced, valve seats to be cut. Days 5 through 8. While the block was at the machine shop, Harmon serviced the hydraulic system, the electrical system, the cooling system, and the fuel system. Every hose checked. Every component on the spare parts list verified to be in the cabinet or added if missing. Day 9. Machine shop work returned. Harmon picked it up in his truck. 14 degrees. He drove with the windows cracked to keep the windshield clear because the truck's defroster was marginal. He did not stop for coffee. He brought the parts back to the shop and continued. Days 10 through 17, short block assembly. The careful work of building the rotating assembly correctly, crank in the block with new main bearings torqued correctly, connecting rods fitted with new rod bearings, new pistons installed with rings gapped and positioned correctly for each cylinder. This was the work where the 11-degree morning had required the torch and the wool gloves. Days 18 through 22. Head work. New valves where required. Valve grinding on all remaining valves. Valve lapping. New valve stem seals. Head installed with new head gasket. Torqued in 3 passes in the correct sequence. Days 23 through 25. Final assembly. Startup preparation. First start. The engine had started on the 3rd crank on February 28th. 25 days. 14 to 11 degrees, sometimes colder. A space heater that brought the shop to a temperature where Harmon could see his breath. A propane torch for the specific tasks where hand sensitivity was critical. Wool gloves from his wife's gardening supplies. And on the morning of February 28th, the engine running clean in the cold air, Harmon had stood in the shop and listened to it idle and known that the 11 weeks between now and the planting window would be enough. He had driven the tractor into the farm lane. He had listened to the engine in the February cold. He had gone back to the shop to start the planter service. Gil Faber had started his valve job on March 18th. He had a warm shop by then. He had finished on March the 31st. He had not had time for the full parts cabinet audit. On July 14th, Harmon had a spare hydraulic hose fitting. Gil had not had a spare seal kit. 38 minutes versus 5 hours. 4 bushels per acre on Gil's south field. 147 bushels per acre on Harmon's corn. Best yield of his farming life. The shop had been 14 degrees on February 3rd. Harmon had picked up his tools and started work. That is where the 147 bushels started. Let me tell you what Harmon said when I asked him whether the cold had ever made him question whether the February work was worth doing. He had been 77 years old, sitting in the farmhouse kitchen that looked out over the shop where he had done 11 winters of February rebuild work before his son took over. He had looked at the window for a moment. He had said, "The cold is the whole point." He had paused. "If I waited for a warm shop, I'd be doing this work in March when everyone else was also doing it." He had paused. "February is available to me because February is uncomfortable." He had said, "I'm not tougher than Gil. I'm just more comfortable being uncomfortable than he is." He had paused. He had said, "The corn doesn't know I was cold in February. It knows whether the equipment was ready in April." He had looked at the window. He had said, "The 147 bushels is the February work expressed in corn. The 147 bushels is the February work expressed in corn." Gil Faber had said, "Wait for spring." Harmon had said, "The planting window doesn't move because I'm cold." He had been right. The planting window did not move. The parts cabinet did not fill itself. The engine did not rebuild itself. The February work did all of it in a shop where he could see his breath. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what is the coldest shop work you have ever done, and what did it produce? The shop on the Diehl farm is still standing. Harmon's son runs the operation now. He does the February work the same way Harmon did, starting on the 1st of February, working through the cold, finishing before March, so that March is available for the planter service and the equipment check and the full parts cabinet audit that saved a cultivation day in July of 1977. The shop record shows every February rebuild going back to 1967. Harmon's handwriting through 1991. His son's handwriting since. 47 consecutive February rebuilds on the same Logan County farm. The space heater is still in the corner. The thermometer still reads 14 on a February morning. The breath is still visible until about 9:30 when the heater catches up. The work starts at 6. Let me tell you about the 11 winters of February rebuild work that Harmon did before his son took over, because 11 winters is a pattern, and the pattern reveals what the practice actually is. Winter 1, 1967 to 1968. Harmon had been farming his own ground for 3 years. He had 1 tractor and 1 combine, both bought used. The tractor needed front axle kingpins and bushings, not an engine job, but a winter shop job. He had done it in January of 1968, when the temperature in the shop had been 18 degrees on the warmest day of the project. He had finished in 6 days and had a front axle that did not shimmy on the road and did not wear the tires unevenly through the season. His neighbor at the time had been running a front axle shimmy all through the 1967 season. Not bad enough to stop work. Bad enough to be wearing the tires and the steering components in ways that would eventually require a repair that was going to cost 3 times what the early intervention would have cost. The neighbor had repaired the shimmy in the summer of 1968 when a steering component failed in the field. He had lost a day and a half. The king pins and bushings done in the summer had cost $340. Harmon had done his in January for $87 in parts. Winter 6, 1972 to 1973. The 1959 tractor needed a carburetor rebuild and a magneto service. Not major work. 4 hours total. Harmon had done it on December 28th, one of the coldest days of that winter, in a shop that got to 22 degrees by noon. He had finished by 2:30 in the afternoon. His neighbor, Gil Faber, had been meaning to do the same maintenance on his machine since September. He had not done it by planting thyme. The magneto had failed during the 2nd week of planting, not catastrophically, but enough to require a dealer call and a service visit that had cost Gil 2 days of planting time and the service charge at the peak season rate. The carburetor had been running lean all season, contributing to fuel efficiency losses that Gil had attributed to poor fuel quality, rather than to the carburetor that had needed service since September. Winter 11, 1977 to 1978. The full engine rebuild described above. 14 degrees, the breath visible, the torque wrench that required the torch and the wool gloves, and 30 minutes of thinking rather than a day off. The pattern across 11 winters. Harmon started in December or January. He finished before March. He had March available for planter service, implement check, parts cabinet audit. He entered the planting window with every piece of equipment on the farm in the best mechanical condition it could be in, with every spare part that was likely to fail during a critical window stocked in the cabinet. Gil Faber started in March, sometimes late March. He finished the primary engine work before planting. He did not have time for the full complement of secondary work. He entered the planting window with the primary machine ready and the secondary systems somewhere between maintained and not. 11 years of this pattern on 2 adjacent farms produced 11 years of evidence about what February work is worth. Harmon's corn yields averaged 131 bushels per acre across the 11 years. Logan County average, 117 bushels. 14 bushels per acre average advantage over 11 years. Gil Faber's corn yields averaged 121 bushels per acre across the same 11 years, 4 bushels above the county average, respectable, but 4 below Harmon. The 10-bushel average gap between Harmon and Gil was not entirely attributable to the February shop work. Some of it was seed selection, some of it was fertilizer management, some of it was drainage differences between the 2 farms. But the maintenance discipline was a contributing factor, and the July 1977 cultivation day was the clearest single example of what the contributing factor looked like in practice. Harmon did not point this out to Gil. He had not kept the comparative yield data for the purpose of making a point about shop work. He had kept it because he was the kind of man who kept records of things that mattered. When I showed him the comparison, his 11-year average, Gil's 11-year average, the county average, he had been quiet for a long time. He had said Gil was a good farmer. He had paused. He had said 4 bushels is the difference between a good farmer and a good farmer who does the work in February. He had paused again. He had said, I'm not sure 4 bushels per acre is worth freezing your hands in February for 11 years. He had looked at the window. He had said, but 147 bushels in 1977 was. That year was worth it by itself. He had smiled. He had said, the problem with February work is you never know which year is going to be the 147 bushel year. So you have to do it every year. He was right. You never know which year is going to be the 147 bushel year. So you do the February work every year in the cold shop with the breath visible, because the year when it matters, the year when the hose fitting is in the cabinet and the 5-hour loss becomes a 38-minute fix, that year is coming. You just do not know when. Harmon had been ready in 1977, the breath visible, the torque wrench and the wool gloves, the spare hose fitting in the cabinet, 147 bushels. The planting window does not move because you are cold. The corn does not know you were cold in February. It knows whether the equipment was ready. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. The equipment was ready. It is always ready on the Diehl farm. It has been ready every February since 1967. 47 consecutive winters of the same work in the same shop. The space heater, the frozen windows, the breath visible until 9:30. The work starts at 6. It will start this February, too. Let me tell you about what the shop looks like on a February morning in Logan County, Ohio, because I want you to understand what 14 degrees in a farm shop is and is not. 14 degrees in a farm shop is not the same as 14 degrees outside. Outside, 14 degrees has wind and sky and the specific cold of open space. In the shop, the space heater has been running since 5 a.m., and the shop is in a state of cold equilibrium, not warming, not cooling, just sitting at 14 degrees because that is where the heater's output and the shop's insulation and the overnight low have settled the situation. The concrete floor is colder than 14 degrees. Concrete holds cold differently than air holds it. Standing on the concrete in work boots, you feel the cold coming up through the boots in a way that is separate from and additional to the ambient 14 degrees. Harmon had learned to put a piece of plywood under his feet in the work area during February work, a single sheet of 3/4-inch plywood between his boot soles and the concrete floor, which reduced the cold transmission enough to extend the time he could work comfortably by approximately an hour. The tools are cold. A wrench in a shop at 14 degrees is 14 degrees, which means the steel is transferring cold to your hands faster than you're transferring warmth to it. Work gloves help but reduce feel. No gloves is faster but colder. Harmon had developed a rotation: 3 minutes with gloves, 1 minute without to do the work that required feel, 3 minutes with gloves that kept his hands functional through a full day of work. The oil is thick. Engine oil at 14 degrees has a viscosity that makes draining it slower and cleaning with it less effective. Harmon had learned to bring a portable propane flame to warm the oil before draining, not to the point of heat, but to the point of thickening reduction. Cold oil that flows rather than cold oil that barely moves. This added approximately 20 minutes to each oil drain, but saved the time that would have been lost to incomplete drain and messy cleanup. The breath. The breath is the thing Gil had seen when he came over on February 3rd. Standing in the shop at 14 degrees, every exhale produces a cloud of visible moisture, not dramatic, not a theatrical puff of steam, but a steady, visible reminder that the shop is cold and the body is warm, and the difference between those two temperatures is being bridged every 20 seconds with each exhalation. Harmon had stopped noticing the breath by day 3 of any February project. It was there. It did not change the work. What changed the work was the discipline of arriving at 6 o'clock and leaving when the work was done. Not arriving at 7 o'clock because 6 o'clock was cold and the shop was colder than it would be at 7 o'clock. Not leaving at 3 o'clock because the hands were cold and spring was coming and there was time. Arriving at 6 o'clock. Leaving when the work was done. Every day from the 1st of February until the rebuild was finished and the planter service was done and the parts cabinet was audited and the list was complete. The discipline was the whole thing. The torque wrench and the wool gloves were the discipline made practical in a specific, difficult moment. The plywood sheet under the boots was the discipline made comfortable in a way that did not sacrifice the work. The propane flame on the cold oil was the discipline finding the efficient solution to a problem rather than accepting the inefficient one. Harmon had said, "The cold is the whole point." He had meant, the cold is what keeps other men out of the shop in February. The cold is the barrier that makes February valuable. A shop without a barrier would be used by everyone. A shop with a 14-degree barrier is used by the men who have decided the work is more important than the warmth. He had crossed that barrier 47 times. His son has crossed it 47 more times since. 94 consecutive Februaries of cold shop work on the same Logan County farm. The space heater runs from 5 a.m. The breath is visible until 9:30. The plywood is under the feet. The wool gloves are in the coat pocket. The work starts at 6. Gil Faber had said, "Wait for spring." Harmon had said, "The planting window doesn't move because I'm cold." The 147 bushels per acre in 1977 had agreed with Harmon. So had every February since. The shop door opens at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of February. It has opened at 6 o'clock on the 1st of February on the Diehl farm for 94 consecutive years. The breath is visible. The work starts. That is the whole thing.